Imagine this. You wake up one morning feeling ready to enjoy a quiet day on your property, maybe doing some chores or just relaxing in your own space. But then, you hear something strange: laughter, music, and the sound of people gathering where they absolutely shouldn't be. You rush outside, confused and a little worried, only to realize that a full-blown wedding is happening right in your barn. And the most shocking part? Nobody asked you. Not a single person. No permission, no heads up. Just a big event unfolding on your land like you weren't even there. Now, think about how you'd feel in that moment. Would you be angry? Shocked? Maybe even a little powerless? Because that's exactly what happened to me. Someone, who I'll call the infamous HOA Karen, because that's what she really felt like, decided my barn was the perfect place for a wedding. And she didn't just stop at deciding. She went ahead and hosted the whole thing without so much as a "Hey, is this okay with you?" It was as if my property was public space, available for anyone to use whenever they felt like it. The barn, for me, isn't just a building. It's private. It's personal. It's part of my home, my life, my space where I keep my things and enjoy some peace away from the noise of everyday life. And suddenly, it was invaded by a crowd of strangers, all dressed up, celebrating something I had no idea was happening right under my nose. It felt like someone had barged into my living room and started throwing a party without asking. You can imagine the rush of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and yes, a fair share of frustration. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just some random neighbor or passerby. No, this was the HOA, our homeowners association, the very people who are supposed to help manage the community and keep things in order. But instead of respecting boundaries or communicating properly, this Karen took it upon herself to make a decision that impacted me directly. It was a blatant disregard for my rights and my property, wrapped up in the kind of entitlement that makes you want to shake your head in disbelief. But let me back up a bit. You might wonder how something like this could happen in the first place. How could an event like a wedding sneak onto your property without you knowing? Well, that's part of the story. Sometimes people think that because a property is part of a community or near shared spaces, they have some kind of informal permission. Or maybe they think rules don't apply to them if they hold a little bit of authority, like being part of the HOA. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. Your space is invaded, your peace is broken, and you're left wondering what just happened. The moment I realized what was going on, a lot of questions flooded my mind. Who gave permission? Was there a miscommunication? Or was this just a case of someone deciding their desires outweighed everyone else's rights? The fact that it was a wedding only made it more intense. Weddings are supposed to be joyful, beautiful celebrations. But when they happen without respect or consent, they turn into something else entirely: a violation, a disturbance, a problem. You know that feeling when you're at home and you hear your doorbell ring unexpectedly? Now imagine dozens of people showing up, dressed in their best clothes, setting up tables, music blaring, and no one there to tell them to stop. It's overwhelming, right? That's exactly how it felt. My barn, my sanctuary, was taken over like it was some sort of event hall, all because one person thought it was okay to just use it. I won't lie, my initial reaction was a mix of disbelief and rising anger. I thought, how could someone be so bold? So careless? But instead of letting those feelings paralyze me, I started thinking about how I could respond. Because this wasn't just about a barn or a wedding. It was about respect, boundaries, and standing up for what's mine. And if you think this story ends with a simple conversation or a polite request, think again. Because that's not how it went down. The situation called for something more unexpected. Something that would send a clear message without causing a big confrontation. But what could that be? How do you handle a Karen who ignores your rights and hosts a wedding without your say? Well, that's where the story gets really interesting. But before I get ahead of myself, imagine being in my shoes, facing that kind of situation, and wondering how far you'd go to protect your space and make sure something like this never happens again. It's a feeling many people can relate to, when someone crosses the line and takes advantage of your kindness or your silence. Whether it's a noisy neighbor, a stranger on your land, or an overreaching HOA member, that moment when you realize your privacy is gone hits hard. You want to respond, but you also want to do it in a way that's smart, effective, and maybe even a little bit unexpected. So, what would you do? Would you call the police? Confront the guests? Or maybe quietly shut down the event? For me, the answer was something completely different, and it involved a few goats. Yes, goats. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Just know this, when someone takes what's yours without asking, it's not just about the property, it's about respect, boundaries, and standing your ground. And sometimes, standing your ground means being creative in the most surprising ways possible. The barn wasn't just any old building sitting quietly on the edge of my property. It was a space I cared about deeply. Weathered wood and rusty hinges aside, it held memories, quiet moments, and the kind of peace that only a place you call your own can offer. It was where I spent weekends fixing things, where I stored tools, and where my goats roamed freely when the weather was kind. To outsiders, it might have looked like just a big, empty barn, but to me, it was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape from the hustle and bustle and just breathe. Living in a community with a homeowners association has its pros and cons. The HOA is supposed to keep things orderly, ensure everyone follows the rules, and make sure the neighborhood looks nice. For the most part, it does that, but sometimes, it feels like the HOA is more interested in controlling things than helping people. They set the rules, enforce the rules, and sometimes, those rules feel like they come with a side of unnecessary drama. And then there's the kind of person who takes those rules and turns them into a power trip. That's where Karen enters the story. You know the type, the person who's always ready to complain, always policing others, and always convinced they're in the right, no matter what. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the kind of HOA member who made you roll your eyes behind her back. She thought the community's rules applied to everyone but herself, and she had no problem stepping on toes to make sure things went her way. And when she got the idea to use my barn for a wedding, she didn't think twice about asking me. After all, in her mind, she had the authority. This whole situation began quietly. I wasn't at home the day the preparations started. From what I gathered later, Karen had called around, organized things behind the scenes, and made it seem like everything was approved. But it wasn't. Not by me, not by anyone with real authority over my property. It was a sneaky move, a power play wrapped up in the excitement of planning a big event. And I was completely blindsided. When I found out, I had a million thoughts running through my head. How could she think this was okay? Did she really believe my barn was hers to give away for events? What kind of message did this send about respect and boundaries? I kept replaying the moment over and over, walking outside and seeing strangers milling around, decorations hanging from the beams, tables set up where my goats usually lounged. It was surreal, almost like being in a dream where everything is familiar but wrong at the same time. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about a barn or a wedding. It was about control. Karen wanted to show that she had power, that she could bend rules and take liberties because she was part of the HOA. But in doing so, she crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. It was a lesson in how authority can sometimes make people forget the simple rules of respect and decency. What made it worse was how no one seemed to question it. Guests showed up, probably assuming everything was fine. The wedding planner, the caterers, even the musicians were all in on it. And yet, no one reached out to me. No one asked, "Hey, is this okay?" Not even once. It was like I didn't exist. And that kind of disregard cuts deep. It's one thing to have a conflict with a neighbor, but when a whole event happens on your land without you knowing, it feels like a violation. I started talking to other neighbors, trying to figure out if anyone else had experienced something similar. Some said they had run-ins with Karen before, small things that showed her tendency to push boundaries and take matters into her own hands. Others felt stuck, unsure how to stand up to someone so entrenched in the community's power structure. It wasn't just me against her. It felt like a whole system that enabled this kind of behavior. As the day of the wedding approached, the tension built. I debated what to do. Should I confront Karen directly? Call the HOA board? Or try to stop the event quietly? Every option had its risks, and none felt like a perfect solution. But one thing was clear. I couldn't just let this happen without some kind of response. It was my barn, my rules, and I wasn't going to sit back and watch someone else take control without asking. Meanwhile, The barn itself was being transformed. What had once been a quiet, dusty space was now decorated with flowers, ribbons, and fairy lights. Tables were covered in white cloth, and chairs were arranged neatly for guests. It was almost pretty, if it weren't happening without my consent. The goats that usually wandered the barn were nowhere to be seen. I knew I had to act before they got involved in the chaos, or before the event turned into a full-blown disaster. The whole situation was a mess of emotions, anger, frustration, disbelief, but beneath it all was a growing determination. I realized this was about more than just one event. It was about setting boundaries and making sure my voice was heard. Karen's actions weren't just disrespectful. They were a warning sign about what happens when people feel entitled and unchecked. In communities like ours, where everyone's lives are connected in small ways, respect is supposed to be the foundation. But when people start thinking their authority puts them above others, it breaks down. That's what this wedding in my barn really revealed, a breakdown in respect, communication, and understanding. I kept asking myself, how do you handle someone like Karen? Someone who feels entitled to your space and your peace. How do you stand up to that kind of power without making things worse? It wasn't just a personal question, it was a question about community, fairness, and what it means to respect others. As the wedding day came closer, I knew I had to make a choice. And the decision I made was something no one expected. Because sometimes, when respect is ignored, the response has to be just as unexpected. But more on that soon. For now, just imagine the kind of situation where your peaceful barn turns into a wedding venue overnight, all because one person thought they had the right to decide for you. That's the kind of challenge I was facing, and it was only the beginning. Finding out that my barn was being used for a wedding without my permission was like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just upset, I was stunned. How could this happen? How could someone just decide to throw a big event on my property like it was theirs to give away? When I first heard the music and the chatter, I thought maybe it was a small gathering, nothing major. But as I approached, it hit me, this wasn't just a few friends hanging out. It was a full wedding celebration, complete with guests, decorations, and all the things that go with it. Walking closer, I could see people dressed up in fancy clothes, tables laid out with food and drinks, and even a small stage where a band was playing. All of it was happening inside my barn. My barn. A place I hadn't shared with anyone, certainly not for a wedding. It felt like someone had taken my private world and turned it into their party playground. The shock quickly turned to anger. I couldn't believe someone had the audacity to pull this off without so much as asking. My mind raced. Who organized this? Who gave permission? Was the HOA really behind this, or was it just Karen acting on her own? Every part of me wanted to storm in and shut it down immediately, but I knew I had to stay calm. I had to figure out what was going on and how to handle this without making the situation worse. Still, the feeling of violation was real. It's not every day someone treats your property like public space. I thought about the hours I had spent maintaining that barn, fixing the roof, clearing out old junk, painting the walls. It was more than just a building. It was part of my life. And now, here were strangers celebrating an event that I had no say in a place I'd worked hard to care for. The disrespect stung hard. As I stood there, watching the wedding unfold, I noticed the looks on some guests' faces. Some seemed oblivious to the fact that this wasn't a regular venue. Others looked excited, caught up in the celebration, probably unaware of the drama happening just beneath the surface. None of them knew how much this moment meant to me, or how it had been stolen. I thought about confronting Karen. I wanted to ask her why she'd do this. Why she'd think it was okay to use my barn without asking. But I also worried about how she'd react. People like that rarely admit they're wrong. They tend to double down, insist they're in the right, and make the situation even messier. I didn't want a big fight in front of all these guests. It would only create chaos and maybe make things worse for everyone involved. Instead, I decided to gather some information first. I started talking quietly to a few neighbors and other HOA members. Turns out, Karen had been planning this behind the scenes for weeks. She'd convinced some people that it was all approved, that she had the authority to book the barn for community events. No one bothered to check with me. No one thought to ask for my permission. This wasn't just careless, it was intentional. Karen had taken advantage of her position to push her agenda. She'd ignored the rules, the respect that should have been there, and treated my property like it was hers to control. It was frustrating and infuriating all at once. The more I learned, the clearer it became. This wedding was more than just an event. It was a statement. Karen wanted to show she had power, that she could get away with stepping over boundaries and controlling things in the neighborhood. But in doing so, she made an enemy of me, and anyone else who valued respect and fairness. The situation felt like a powder keg. Every minute, more guests arrived, more decorations went up, and more people got caught up in the celebration. Meanwhile, I was stuck trying to figure out how to stop this without causing a scene. I thought about calling the police, but it seemed extreme, especially with a wedding in full swing. Plus, I wasn't sure how much they could do without clear proof or prior warning. Instead, I decided to wait and see how things unfolded. I kept an eye on Karen, watching how she behaved, how she interacted with guests, and how she tried to justify what she'd done. She acted like she was hosting the party of the year, completely oblivious to the fact that she was on the wrong side of the line. As the ceremony started, I felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, it was hard to watch something so special happening without my approval. On the other, I knew I had to keep my cool and plan my next move carefully. Reacting impulsively would only make things worse. I noticed that some guests were beginning to get uncomfortable. The tension in the air wasn't just from the heat or the crowd, it was the unspoken sense that something wasn't right. The celebration felt like it was built on shaky ground, like it could crumble if anyone spoke up. And that's when I realized I had to do something unexpected. Something that would make it clear this was my land, my rules, and that nobody, not even Karen, could just take over without consequences. But whatever I did next, it had to be smart, subtle, and memorable. I took a deep breath and started putting my plan into action. This wasn't about ruining the wedding or causing drama. It was about standing up for myself in a way that would be impossible to ignore. After all, when someone invades your space without asking, sometimes you have to get creative to send a message loud and clear. When I realized that the wedding was in full swing and there was no way to stop it through the usual means, I knew I had to think outside the box. I couldn't just sit back and let someone else decide how my property was used. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with determination. I wanted to send a message, not with words alone, but with something that would make everyone understand this wasn't just a minor annoyance. It was a serious violation. That's when my mind went to the goats. Yes, the goats. They're not just cute animals wandering the barn. They're part of the family and, if needed, excellent protectors of their turf. They're curious, lively, and not shy about making their presence known. I figured if I unleashed them, it would create a scene nobody would forget anytime soon. I walked over to their pen and opened the gate slowly, trying not to cause a commotion just yet. The goats looked up at me, as if sensing something was about to happen. They stretched their necks and gave little bleats, ready for whatever came next. I let them out one by one, and as they trotted into the barn, the atmosphere started to change. The music was still playing, the guests were chatting and laughing, but soon enough, a ripple of surprise and confusion spread through the crowd. At first, people just stopped what they were doing, looking around to figure out what was going on. Then the goats, with their unpredictable and slightly mischievous energy, began exploring the space. One goat nudged a tablecloth, sending plates and glasses wobbling. Another started chewing on some decorations hanging from the beams. Guests jumped back, some laughing nervously, others clearly caught off guard. The calm, elegant vibe of the wedding instantly shifted to something more chaotic and unexpected. I watched as the goats wandered freely, some people trying to gently shoo them away, but the goats were quick and clever. They darted between legs, snuck under chairs, and made their way to the buffet, clearly interested in sampling the food. The look on Karen's face was priceless, shock mixed with frustration. She wasn't prepared for this at all. What made the whole moment even better was how the goats seemed to sense the tension. They weren't aggressive, but they definitely took over the barn like they owned it. Every time someone tried to move them, they'd bleat loudly or nudge back with a stubborn little headbutt. It was like the goats were standing guard on my behalf, protecting the property in their own way. The guests were caught in the middle, some amused, some annoyed, and some just bewildered. The wedding planner tried to keep things under control, but the goats had other plans. They became the unexpected stars of the event, stealing attention and causing a gentle uproar. It wasn't just about creating chaos, though. This was a statement. I wanted everyone there to realize that this wasn't a place to be used without permission. That my property, my rules, weren't something to be taken lightly. And what better way to show that than with a herd of curious, unpredictable goats making themselves at home? As the goats continued their exploration, I noticed conversations shifting. People started whispering about the audacity of using someone else's barn without asking. Karen tried to regain control, but it was clear the moment had slipped away from her. The goats had changed the game, and no amount of planning or authority could bring back the calm that was lost. I stayed on the sidelines, keeping an eye on everything. I wasn't there to ruin anyone's special day, but I needed to protect what was mine. And the goats were doing that better than I ever could with words alone. It was almost like they had a sixth sense about the situation, acting as the perfect, natural response to an unnatural invasion. Every time a goat bleated or knocked over a chair, it reminded everyone present that respect and boundaries matter. It was a silent message, but one that spoke louder than any argument. Sometimes, when words fail, actions, and a little help from some unexpected allies, make things clear in a way nothing else can. The scene was surreal but satisfying. A wedding filled with laughter and music had been transformed into an event no one would forget anytime soon. Not because of the vows or the decorations, but because of a few determined goats reclaiming their territory. And while I knew this might ruffle some feathers with the HOA and Karen, I also knew it was necessary. Sometimes standing up for yourself means getting creative, using what you have, and making sure your voice and your space are respected in a way people won't ignore. The goats continued to roam, their playful energy bringing a different kind of life to the barn. And in that moment, with the chaos unfolding around me, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The message had been sent. The boundaries had been drawn. And my barn was, once again, mine. After the goats had their unexpected moment of glory, the wedding guests scrambled to regain some sense of order. Chairs were pulled back hastily, plates gathered up, and a few people tried to corral the mischievous animals. But it was clear the mood had shifted. The carefully planned, picture-perfect event had turned into something no one had anticipated. Chaotic, unpredictable, and utterly unforgettable. Karen's face was a storm of frustration and disbelief. Her grand plan to control the barn and host an event without asking had completely unraveled before her eyes. The power she thought she held slipped through her fingers, and all she could do was watch as the goats took over. She tried to wave her hands, shout instructions, and rally the guests, but it was like trying to control the wind. The animals were just too quick, too clever, and clearly more at home in the barn than anyone else. Around me, whispers started to grow louder. Some guests looked at me, realizing who really owned the place. Others exchanged glances, suddenly aware that this event had been held without permission. The shock turned into a quiet respect. People started to understand what I had been dealing with, the invasion of my private space, the lack of respect, and the way Karen had tried to force her will on everyone. It wasn't long before a few neighbors who had heard about the situation arrived, drawn by the noise and confusion. They looked around, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some offered quiet words of support, understanding exactly how tough it could be to deal with someone like Karen. I felt a bit of relief knowing I wasn't alone in this. The community wasn't just a place of rules and regulations. It was made up of people who cared, and some of them were ready to stand up too. As the goats wandered and explored, a subtle shift started to happen. The guests who had been so eager to celebrate began to realize this wasn't their space to take over. The wedding planner approached me cautiously, explaining how sorry they were for the misunderstanding and that they hadn't meant to disrespect me or my property. I nodded, appreciating the apology but knowing the bigger issue was still there. Karen tried to salvage what was left of the event, but the magic was gone. Her usual confidence was replaced by awkward apologies and forced smiles. It was clear that the barn, and this neighborhood, weren't hers to command. Her position in the HOA didn't give her the right to ignore others' boundaries or steamroll over their wishes. Meanwhile, the goats had made their way to the edge of the barnyard, munching on the grass and occasionally looking back as if checking on the chaos they had caused. Their presence was a reminder that nature, like respect, couldn't be controlled by force. It had to be understood and honored. I took a moment to look around and breathe in the air. The barn, my barn, was still standing. It had survived the day's unexpected party and the surprise visitors who didn't belong. The wood creaked softly in the breeze, and the scent of hay mixed with wildflowers drifted through the open doors. Despite everything, the space still felt like home. The guests began to leave slowly, many of them exchanging quiet goodbyes and apologies. Some lingered a bit, perhaps reflecting on the unusual day they'd experienced. I overheard snippets of conversation about boundaries, respect, and the importance of asking before assuming. It was a lesson not just for Karen, but for everyone involved. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the barnyard, I felt a sense of calm return. The chaos had passed, replaced by the steady rhythm of the evening settling in. My goats returned to their pen, tired from their adventure but happy to be back in their familiar space. I knew the aftermath of this day would bring challenges. Karen wouldn't take this lightly, and the HOA would have questions. But I was ready. The line had been drawn, and I wasn't going to back down. This was more than a dispute about a barn or a wedding. It was about respect, fairness, and standing up for what's right. Looking forward, I realized this experience had changed something. It had shown me the power of taking control of a situation, even when it feels out of your hands. Sometimes, the best way to deal with disrespect is not just to say no, but to make sure your message is heard loud and clear, whether through words, actions, or, in my case, a herd of very determined goats. The neighborhood wouldn't forget this day anytime soon, and neither would I. It was a story of boundaries crossed, of power misused, and of a community shaken awake. But most importantly, it was a story of standing firm, even when the odds feel stacked against you. Because in the end, respect is something you don't ask for, you make people understand it. And as the night grew darker, I knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for me or my barn, but for the whole neighborhood. A chapter where respect mattered more than control, and where everyone had a voice, no matter how loud or quiet, they chose to make it. The next morning, the barn was quiet again, but the echoes of the previous day still lingered in the air. I walked through the space, noticing the subtle changes, the slightly crooked chairs, the remnants of torn decorations, the faint scent of goat mingled with the usual smell of hay and wood. It was as if the barn itself was carrying a story, one that wasn't going to fade anytime soon. I couldn't help but smile a little, knowing the goats had made their mark in a way nothing else could. News of the wedding and the goat invasion spread quickly through the neighborhood. People were talking, some in whispers, some outright surprised by what had happened. I started receiving messages and calls from neighbors who wanted to hear my side of the story. Many expressed support and shared their own frustrations about the HOA's antics, especially Karen's overreach. It felt good to know I wasn't alone in feeling that way. Others were curious, wanting to know exactly how I handled the situation without causing a full-blown disaster. The HOA board soon scheduled an emergency meeting to address what had happened at the barn. Karen was expected to defend her actions, but I was prepared with facts and a calm determination that came from knowing I had done the right thing. I wasn't there just to complain, I was there to set things straight and make sure this kind of disrespect didn't happen again. As the meeting began, tension filled the room. Karen tried to spin the story, making it sound like a community-building event that was meant to bring people together. But her words felt hollow, especially when I calmly explained how no permission was given, how the event violated my property rights, and how her misuse of HOA power was unacceptable. Other board members started to murmur, some nodding quietly, clearly sensing the truth beneath my words. What surprised me most was the support I received from unexpected places. A few neighbors who had once stayed quiet stepped up, sharing their own experiences with Karen's controlling behavior. It was like a dam breaking. Suddenly, the hidden frustrations of many were out in the open. The room shifted from defense to accountability, and Karen found herself increasingly isolated. I stayed focused, knowing this was my chance to protect my barn and my peace of mind. I suggested clear rules for the use of community property, emphasizing the need for transparency, respect, and, most importantly, permission. It wasn't about shutting down community events, it was about fairness and communication. Everyone deserved to be heard and respected. After a long discussion, the board agreed to implement new guidelines and to reconsider Karen's role in organizing events. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a start. More than that, it sent a message: abuse of power wouldn't be tolerated, and respect for neighbors was non-negotiable. Walking out of that meeting, I felt lighter. The weight of the past few days was still there, but it was balanced by a sense of accomplishment. I had stood my ground, and it had made a difference. The barn was more than just a building. It was a symbol of standing up for what's right, even when it feels hard. Back at home, I spent time repairing the barn, fixing small damages and tidying up. It felt good to restore the space to its original calm, but I knew the story of the goats and the wedding would be part of this place forever. It was a reminder that sometimes chaos brings clarity, and that respect has to be earned, not assumed. Over the next weeks, the neighborhood slowly began to change. Conversations about respect and boundaries became more common. People started paying closer attention to how decisions were made, and the power dynamics in the HOA shifted. Karen's influence faded, replaced by voices that cared about fairness and community spirit. The goats, of course, remained the quiet heroes of the story. Whenever I brought them out to the barn, neighbors would smile or laugh, remembering the day they took over the wedding and reminded everyone who really owned the place. It was funny how a few animals could do what words and meetings sometimes couldn't. This whole experience taught me a lot about standing up for myself and the power of community. It's not always easy to confront people who try to control or disrespect you, especially when they hold some authority. But with patience, creativity, and a little help from unexpected friends, it's possible to shift the balance. I started seeing the barn not just as a building, but as a symbol of resilience. It was a place where boundaries were respected, where fairness was fought for, and where even goats could be part of the story. And as the neighborhood continued to grow and change, I knew this was just one chapter in a much bigger journey. People began to ask me what I would do if something like this happened again. Honestly, I wasn't sure. But I did know one thing: next time, I wouldn't hesitate to protect what's mine, no matter what. The goats had shown me that sometimes, the best way to get your point across isn't with words alone, but with action and a little bit of unexpected surprise. And so, life went on. The barn stood tall, the goats roamed happily, and the neighborhood was a little wiser. Sometimes, standing up for yourself means shaking things up and reminding people that respect isn't optional, it's essential. After the dust settled and the neighborhood had time to process everything, I started noticing subtle changes all around. People who once avoided confrontation were speaking up more. Neighbors began checking in on one another, making sure everyone felt heard and respected. The atmosphere shifted from tense and uncertain to cautiously hopeful. It was clear that the events at the barn had sparked something bigger than anyone expected. Even Karen seemed different. The fire in her eyes had dimmed just a little, replaced by a quieter, more cautious demeanor. She wasn't as quick to assert control or push her agenda like before. Maybe the goats, and the fallout from that wedding, had taught her a lesson about power and respect. Or maybe she realized she could no longer operate with the same unchecked authority. Either way, the dynamic in the HOA had changed, and that change felt like progress. The barn itself became a focal point for the neighborhood, a place that symbolized more than just a building. People started to see it as a reminder that boundaries matter, that respect isn't something to be taken lightly, and that standing up for yourself can lead to real change. I found myself hosting small gatherings, not big parties, just simple meetups where neighbors could talk openly and honestly. It was a chance to rebuild trust and community, piece by piece. During one of these gatherings, an older neighbor shared a story about how the neighborhood had once been a tight-knit community where everyone looked out for each other. She spoke about how respect and communication were the foundation of their shared lives. Listening to her, I realized that what had been lost wasn't just rules or bylaws, but a sense of genuine connection. And maybe the barn incident was the wake-up call the neighborhood needed to start healing. As these meetings became more frequent, I noticed that even Karen started attending quietly at times. She didn't jump in or dominate the conversation like before, but her presence suggested she was listening. Change isn't always about winning or losing, It's about opening the door to understanding. And sometimes, people surprise you when they step through it. Meanwhile, my goats continued to be the beloved wildcards of the neighborhood. Kids would come by to visit them, laughing as the goats nibbled on their shoelaces or chased after stray leaves. The adults would share knowing smiles, remembering the day those goats turned a wedding upside down and reminded everyone who really owned the barn. It became a local legend, something that brought smiles and a sense of shared history. I started thinking more about the lessons hidden in all of this. Life is unpredictable, and sometimes people cross lines without realizing the impact. But when you stand firm, when you show that respect isn't optional, you can change the story. It's not about being confrontational for the sake of it. It's about setting clear boundaries and expecting others to honor them. The HOA meetings were still a challenge at times. Old habits die hard, and some folks resisted the new approach to fairness and transparency. But the momentum was shifting. Conversations became more thoughtful, decisions more democratic, and respect more central. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I realized too that standing up for yourself isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process, a daily choice to protect your space and your peace. And sometimes, it means getting creative, using what you have, whether it's a herd of goats or your voice, to make a point. It means knowing when to push and when to listen, when to stand tall and when to let the quiet strength speak. Looking back, I don't regret how things unfolded. The barn, the goats, the wedding, they all came together in a way that changed not just my life but the neighborhood's. It was messy, unpredictable, and at times frustrating. But it was real. And real is what builds lasting change. Now, when I walk through the barn, I see it differently. It's a symbol of resilience, of community, and of standing up for what's right. The goats are there, happily munching on hay or chasing each other around the yard, completely unaware of their role in this story. But to me and my neighbors, there'll always be the unlikely heroes who reminded us that respect and boundaries aren't just rules, they're the heart of a community. And as the neighborhood moves forward, I'm reminded that change often comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it takes a little chaos, a little courage, and yes, even a few goats to shake things up and set things right.